to introduce who's going. Thank you. Got it. You've got something's come up on my screen.
I think you just need to press OK.
I haven't got an OK. I've got it. Leave the meeting.
That's it. Yeah, I think got it. I think got it. That's the OK.
Got it.
Okay. I'm trying to press it, but mine doesn't want to press off. So OK, it'll probably disappear. So I'm going to ask Kath if she would like to introduce the speakers and tell us which order people are going to speak in. So Kath, your evening. Thank you very, very much for preparing this for us. And over to you now.
Well, thank you for for extending the invitation to us. We and it's lovely to kind of see so many of you here this evening. So thank you for taking the time to join us. I'm Rabbi Kath Vardi. I'm the rabbi at Northwest Surrey Synagogue, which is based in Weybridge, and we have community. Oh my goodness, from Woking, Guildford, Hersham to kind of down in Hampshire to a little bit kind of further up in towards London. We're a very widely spread community, and the community has been going now for well over 50 years. We're a progressive community, which means that we belong to the movement for Reform Judaism, and as you can see, which is egalitarian, progressive, inclusive, and egalitarian. So we have women rabbis. Gender is no barrier to inclusion in active religious life and community life. And that also extends to sexuality and race and gender. So I think we absolutely work really hard to be inclusive, radically inclusive. So we thought this evening, what would be quite interesting is to have maybe a variety of different, not just perspectives, but I think perhaps experiences of what it means to do Jewish. So we have Dr. Dov Softy with us. Hi, Dov, who very kindly and generously accepted the invitation to come and speak to us. And Dov is our head teacher, our youth education leader in the synagogue. And our Dov can introduce himself a little bit more, so very briefly. And then also my husband, Meir Vardi, who also has a very particular Jewish experience that he can also actually of the connection. So I wonder whether we.
Sure, yes. Good evening, everybody. I'm Dov.
Yes, that maybe if we hold off for questions until the ends.
Sure.
But I think in terms of questions of discussion, I think more easily if we do that towards the end of each presentation, perhaps.
And we have made arrangements to sort of hand them around, because what it does, it doesn't interrupt the richness of what you're saying with somebody coming in with a particular question. So keep your questions, write them on the list if you can, but we just would like to hear, and then at the end we will have time for questions. Dov, is that all right with you?
Yes, excellent. Thank you, Margaret. So good evening again. I'm Dr. Dov Softy, and I'm the head teacher of the synagogue where Rabbi Kath and I work. I am an immigrant to this country. I arrived to live here about 20 years ago. I was born in Israel, first generation in my family to have been born in Israel. My mom was born in Iraq, and my dad was born in India, and they both met in Israel. So and my mom flee Iraq with her family in the 50s, and she was born into Jewish family. There were about 250,000 Jews living in Iraq at the time in the 50s. And when Israel became independent in 1948, life for Jews in many Muslim countries became really dangerous in that they were attacked in the streets, pogroms, looting, rape, you name it. So they did not feel safe there anymore, and they moved to Israel. There's a reason why I'm telling you this, because it's part of my making and it's part of my Judaism as well. Dad was born in India to Indian Jewish family, and moved to Israel in the 60s. So he was a young boy. My mom was a young girl when she moved from Iraq to Israel. They met in Israel. And Hebrew was their common language. Dad spoke Hindi, Mom spoke Arabic, and Hebrew was their common language. And each one of them brought their own tradition from their own countries in terms of Judaism and how, you know, the day of rest, Shabbat, is being celebrated, how the festivals are being celebrated. So I grew up in a mishmash of a family of different ways to celebrate things. And because the Jews lived in Iraq, my family lived in Iraq, you know, stemming back even 2,000 years, really old tradition. And because the Jews of Iraq lived in relative peaceful time in Iraq until recent history, I think the Jews in Iraq were left to express their own Judaism in a very relaxed ways, as opposed to the Jews of Europe, if you like, when the anti-Semitism really forced them into ghettos and changed the type of Judaism that was developed there accordingly. In Iraq, Jews lived relatively well. They were wealthy, not all of them though. And so, you know, traditionally the synagogue will be the center, the hub of the community, but also because there wasn't really real pressure on the Jews to stick together and just together all the time. They could actually mingle with the rest of the population around them. And there they developed a great deal of relationship with the local people in Iraq, and that in turn really relaxed the Judaism. So if Judaism split into two, if you like, to Orthodox Judaism, which you know, people adhere to most of the commands that written for us, and progressive Judaism, which the Torah is open to interpretation, and we adhere to some of the commands and some not. In my family, it was all open for interpretation because they really lived in that sort of relaxed atmosphere. Moving to Israel, my mom moved to Israel with her family, met there my dad. They brought this tradition with them. In India, the Jews really lived peacefully with their neighbors. The Jews of India moved to Israel because they yearned to live among Jews, basically. There was no real pressure on them to leave India. Overall, we are looking at about 50,000 Jews, so really minority within minority. Now, because my background is not European background, and I was born in Israel, really we carved and developed a different sort of relationship with religion, if you like, in my family. And that goes to a lot of other families, which their background is not European background, like my parents. There were about 1 million Jews who lived under Islam, under Muslim countries before 1948. And today we're not talking more than about 50,000 of them in Turkey and in Iran. And so quite a lot of Jews either moved to Israel, to France, Canada, some to this country, and some to the States, but the vast majority of them live in Israel. And we are minority within minority. And so my parents looked for a synagogue to go to, and the synagogue they went to is a synagogue where Iraqi Jews went to. And there they brought all that they knew from Iraq. So, for example, if in Orthodox synagogues, like really strictly Orthodox, men and women sit separately and men cannot see the women, in the synagogue that I went to, men and women sit separately in the synagogue, but we could see the women and the women could see the men as well. We use quite a lot of songs in the synagogue, and a synagogue for me and my family was really a glue to meet other people and to develop friendships there, to not just to go for, Shabbat prayers and during the week prayers, but also to meet people there. So it became sort of a hub of the community. At home, my parents developed their own system of Judaism. So if Orthodox Jews will keep Shabbat, the day of rest, Saturday, as a day of complete rest, so you either go to the synagogue or you sit at home, have meal with your family, and you definitely do not work or watch TV or using your mobile phone or anything like that. In my family, Mom would go to the synagogue in the morning and I would go with her. But when we come back home, we definitely use our mobile phones and we watch TV together. If Orthodox Jews keep the law of kosher food, mainly separating dairy and meat food, and my mom adhered to that, I did not, and that was okay as well. So we're really looking at somewhere in the middle, so taking all these really Orthodox Judaism and make it working for us, make it work for us in modern time. So we were not progressive Jews, as Rabbi Kath will talk about later, I believe, but we were more traditional Jews, if you like, traditional way of expressing your Judaism, but still leaving a lot of room for modern interpretation of what it is to be a Jew. I studied biblical studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem because I was very close to religion anyway at home. And later on, I came to this country. I've done an MA and PhD in history education, and my research was teaching about the Holocaust. And I found myself working with the progressive movement in this country because it was really close to what I learned and lived in Israel as a Jew there. So yes, in Israel, I lived more traditional Judaism, but it's not far from what and the type of Judaism that I experience in this country, and especially with the synagogue at Weybridge. So this is me. If you want to ask me any questions later and sort of elaborate on more aspects, I'll be happy to do so.
Dov, thank you so much for that. Yeah, it's a wonderful introduction, and I think I think we were right asking you to go first, because I think it segues very nicely, perhaps into Meir's story and about Kibbutz Judaism. So Meir, if I can give you the floor.
Hi, my name is Meir. Is it possible to share my screen? Because I prepared the PowerPoint. I'm a good boy.
You should be able
I'll
to
try.
click on
Okay.
share screen.
Okay. I'll share my screen. And can everybody see it? Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Kibbutz Judaism, and I have a feeling that when I say kibbutz, because I look at the generation of the people listening, people will know what I'm talking about. I know that in England, the generation who like from the 60s and the 70s and even the 80s, a lot of them volunteered in a kibbutz, so they
Meir,
you know,
Meir,
yeah, sorry.
Meir, I think it would be really helpful to just tell everybody what a kibbutz. I wouldn't make the assumption that people know what kibbutz is.
Okay. So a kibbutz is a commune. It's like a village, but it's actually was established in the early 20th century as a commune. It was established mainly by young people who I think a lot of them were kind of like tired of the anti-Semitism within communist and socialist movements in Eastern Europe, and they came to Israel, and they tried to find a way of life which will show their feeling of living together. It's based on the idea that everything is shared, people are equal. Basically, there's no wages. You bring in as much as you can, and you get as much as you need, which if you look at the picture, you didn't get much. That kibbutz, this is the picture of my kibbutz, not long after it was established in 1943. In a way, a little bit like, almost like a little citadel. I'm trying to look for the word. It was allowed by the British mandate to be established because there were it was on both Jewish lands, and it was they said it will be for agricultural experiments and not a settlement. That's why the British mandate or the British government allowed it to be established. So I want, before I go on, I want to make a very strong point. The kibbutzim, there is a small, I'll go to, there are about 360 something kibbutzim in Israel. About 15 of them are religious. All the others are totally secular, and sometimes I would say religiously secular, to a point that, for example, a kibbutz next to us, some people wanted to have a synagogue in the kibbutz, and it was a social crisis over there, because people said, how dare you bring a synagogue, a symbol of God, into the kibbutz? So how do you combine socialistic kibbutz with Judaism? I'll try to give a few examples, but before I get to it, I want like Dov, this is, like I said before, establishing a society which is based on socialism, agriculture. This is again my old kibbutz, and this guy is spreading the seeds. You can see they couldn't trust a lot of rain. It was the edge of the desert. And these are my parents. I want to tell a little bit about them in order to give you an idea of the background. They are working. This is one of the only pictures I have of them working in the vegetable garden that they started, which was a huge revolution. My father in '51 won a prize for proving that onion can grow in the desert. But my mother was born in Eastern Europe. She was born in an area called the Carpathrus, which was up to World War II belonged to Czechoslovakia. Now it's in the Ukraine. Who knows, maybe Putin will take it soon. And she was born to an ultra-Orthodox family. Her father was a melamed, who taught children in the Torah. They were dressed in long, dark clothes. They lived in a village in a mountainous area. And up to the age of 12, she lived, like Dov says, the extreme Orthodox life. When she was 12, during World War II, they were kicked out of their village, and the next 4 years, she tried to simply survive, losing on the way all of her family. Out of a family of 2 parents and 5 children, only her and her, she was the older sister, the second sister also survived. Parents, 2 sisters and son all perished in Auschwitz. So once she got to Israel at the age of 16, I don't think she had a lot of faith left in her. My father, if you call my mother an Ashkenazi Jew, Ashkenazi is a Jew who lived in Europe. My father was a Sephardi Jew, closer to the relaxed Judaism that Dov was talking about. He was born in Turkey. And in 1943, Turkey was kind of neutral, but in 1943, after his family lost the shop in flood, and his older brother was drafted to the Turkish army, he decided to get on the train, and he was about 15, get on the train and crossed through Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, into Israel, where he joined the youth movement in Israel. They both established that kibbutz. So they came from these 2 very extreme, and a little bit like Dov said, my mother, her original language was Yiddish, which is like German Jewish. My father, his original language was a combination of Spanish Jewish, and so of course at home we spoke only Hebrew. By the way, just to let you know, that's how the kibbutz looks today after all the dryness that you saw. Okay, so I said, how do you combine Judaism with secular life? And I think any Jewish person, even ultra-Orthodox, will say that Judaism is not only a religion, it's national affiliation. It's belonging to this national group. I think that's the best translation I can find. And so what the kibbutzim, the kibbutz movement, what they tried to do is try to start combining that idea with their life. And the best module to build their life on was the biblical module. How did people live in Israel 2,000 and 3,000 years ago? How did people live there? Because, and I'll try to give examples later, the holidays that we're celebrating in the synagogue in a very religious way, a lot of them were actually agricultural holidays. And that connected very well with the fact that kibbutzim at that point were mainly agricultural. So people tried to bring it back to the agricultural way of life. There's another point that I want to emphasize, and the kibbutzim were in the avant-garde of the movement that saw the Jews in Israel as a new type of Jew. No more the European Jew who has to be afraid, who relies only on the, the community and the Jewish practices, but a new brave Jew who works his land, because Jews, I must emphasize the thing, in Europe, Jews were very rarely allowed to own land. That's why so many Jews in Europe dealt with merchandise, with money, things that you could move from one place to another. They were not allowed to own land. So here comes a new type of Jew who owns his land, who holds the plow in one hand and the gun in the other, who is very, we call it the sabra, who doesn't show his emotions. Sabra is a cacti, which is very spiky on the outside and very sweet on the inside. That's at least the way people wanted to see themselves. This is the brave new Jew. He doesn't speak Yiddish anymore. He doesn't speak Ladino, the Spanish Jewish. He speaks Hebrew, and everybody have to be like that person. And the kibbutzim were almost a symbol of that new Jew. Not almost, they were. So what do? We go back to the sources, the kibbutz, but you take God out of the equation. You celebrate all the holidays, but based on the historical idea, based on the agricultural idea, based on the tradition. And if you bring in the Orthodox way of life, you bring it more as almost like as a museum exhibition. For example, in my kibbutz, it was traditional to have like an Ashkenazi Orthodox dance in the wedding, where people dressed up as if they are religious, and it was very funny, and it's kind of like a reminder of the old days, but it was clearly not the way of life. I want to bring a few examples for that. Two examples. One of them is the bat mitzvah. The bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah is when a child at the age of 13 comes of age and becomes an adult. That is the principle in religious Judaism, even in Reform, Orthodox. In Reform, it's both boys and girls. In Orthodox, it's mainly boys. The child learns to a portion from the Torah. They come and they read it in front of all the community, and they get the blessing. Now you are a man, because if it's an Orthodox. In the kibbutz, they broke it apart and rebuilt it. They said, okay, that means that that person becomes a responsible young adult. Therefore, let's take the group. We're talking about a group. We're talking about a community, like a massive family. Let's take that group of kids and give them a whole set of tasks, which will, for them, will show them that they are coming of age. Tasks like, all the kibbutz used to eat all the meals in a big dining room. So prepare a meal for the whole kibbutz. or go to work in the fields, or help people in need in the nearest town. Tasks that for them would make them feel they're coming of age. And the end of it, the end of the year, the big celebration, bar mitzvah celebration, was usually a performance that the kids prepared for the whole community. Sharing it with the community was very important. Nobody brought any Torah into it, God forbid. Like I said, we were religiously secular. Another example I want to give is Shavuot. There's 3 holidays in the Jewish calendar, which are Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. And these are 3 agricultural dates where Jewish people in old Israel or Judea used to come to bring to go to the main temple in Jerusalem. Every time it depended on the agricultural year. Each one of them is still celebrated. I want to focus on Shavuot because till today it becomes an attraction in kibbutzim. Shavuot, which was the holiday just at the end of spring, beginning of summer, where people would bring over all the first fruits of the fields to the temple. It's in Europe or even in the Middle East, how could people celebrate it? So they would go to the synagogue, they celebrated the giving of the Torah, they read a certain scroll, which is very interesting for itself, the scroll of Ruth. But of course, the agriculture side was kind of like put aside because people were not agricultural. The kibbutz took it totally back into the agriculture. We used to go on Shavuot, we used to go out to the fields. People would bring the first products of their, whether it's the first fruits or the first newborn sheep or cows, and we would have the tractors, and we would have people dancing as performances and celebrating it all in the field in a very, very colorful and agricultural manner. There's lots of other examples, but what I wanted to conclude with, the idea was, like I said, we had very, very strong Jewish identity, but still we totally denounced, I think is the right word, the God. And it was funny because if you look at the holidays, God was somehow, sometimes, how do you say, penetrating into the services here and there, and people tried to keep God on the side because it's hard to disconnect God, but they certainly tried. Kibbutzim are not the same today. A lot has changed, and they're not in the avant-garde of the Israeli society anymore. But that's for another lecture.
Meir, thank you. Thank you very much. I suspect that that's generated lots of questions too. So the connection between Meir and I is that we are spouses, and that's where we met. So Meir and I met on the kibbutz. I went as a young university student after my first year at university as a kibbutz volunteer, and that was my first introduction to Israel, to Judaism, and to kibbutz, the whole thing. So I was born to an Irish Catholic, or a father of Irish Catholic extraction, and a mother who was nominally Protestant. I was brought up with the religion of atheism, with communist atheism. So I was brought up in a very politically very active family. and there was absolutely no room for God. There was no room for God. And so it remained for quite some time, I might add. So Meir and I met, like I say, when I was a university student, but it was another 13 years and a different lifetime later when we met again. And at that point, I think as we were considering about whether or not we wanted to, about how we wanted to raise a family together, then the question of Jewish identity and the family and its meaning, that became very much part of the discussion. And so we decided that I would convert to Judaism, which is what I did. And no one was more surprised than myself, I have to tell you, of suddenly discovering this world which was challenging and engaging, and gave me a framework for building meaning in the world, and that absolutely kind of seamlessly connected to the values that I had been brought up with, but also gave me a language to begin to talk about the ineffable and notions of what it is that we can't see and the divine. And so that's been my pathway. And so I wanted to talk to you about my Judaism. And so I think progressive Judaism came about at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was very much in response to the emancipation of Jewry, and about the breaking down of the ghetto walls, and about the opening up of opportunities in civil society for Jews, and that dilemma then about how does one live one's Judaism in a modernizing contemporary world. And so that, there were many different innovations. So in terms of kind of Jewish ritual, Reformed Jews began to use the vernacular, that sermons started to be given in the vernacular, that the ideas around, because also if you think about, at the turn of the 20th century, we also there's a huge movement, not just around emancipation, but also this movement around rationalization, about rationalism, and about the place for religion in civil society and religion at home, and do the two mix, can they be combined? And so we begin to get this development of a desire to build a religious worldview that can look outwards, that can question maybe some of those sacred cows, and can think about what we profess in worship. Is that something actually that sits with our intellectual understanding of the world as well as our spiritual understanding of the world? So we begin to get kind of, not only do we get liturgical innovation, but we also begin to see a questioning of worldviews which perhaps had been experienced or are being experienced as being overly constraining. And so the inclusivity part, I don't think that was ever really part of it to begin with. So, about the position of women, about men and women sitting together, and whole families being able to sit together in worship. But those things kind of followed on. And so for me, I think what is really central about my Judaism, it's the questions, right? It's about being able to ask the questions. It's about not only being able to ask the questions, but actually being encouraged to ask the questions. And I think for me, perhaps one of my biggest questions is why not? right? You know, we can't do that. Why not? And trying to really build a community where we all can feel that we can say, okay, well, why not? Or how, you know, okay, so how can we make that work? And it's a Judaism which for me needs to be radically pluralistic. It needs to be radically inclusive. It needs to be a Judaism which is able to open its arms really wide and to welcome people in who want to be part of that. And I think, you know, very much I suspect, you know, influenced particularly by my own kind of journey into Judaism. And, you know, and when that has been there, about how amazing that is, and also the many times when it hasn't been there and actually how painful that can be. And so, you know, so I suppose for me, you know, one of the driving forces of my Judaism is about how do we build a radically inclusive community that is open to all, that and that, you know, that we, and also that we don't assume, and we actively don't assume that there are only particular ways of being Jewish or doing Jewish. And so there are many Jews right across, actually, who are very much on the margins. They are on the margins because of their gender. They are on the margins because of their sexuality. They are on the margins because of their age. They are on the margins because of the way that they live their Jewish lives. And actually, when we do that, we rob ourselves of a wealth of you know, a treasure trove of gifts and skills that you know, that actually we can bring to bear in terms of building community together, and we are all the poorer for it when we do that. Judaism is vibrant. It is an amazingly rich living tradition, and I think it's up to us to make sure that we do not become calcified. That, you know, we don't think there are only certain permitted ways of doing things, and I think, you know, and I think that the rabbis. So we have within the Jewish story, with this in the sweep of history, when the temple was destroyed and the priesthood became redundant because there was no temple there. So when the Romans destroyed the temple, so that we had the beginning of a growth of this other group of teachers and learners and thinkers that we now term the rabbis. But they were a group of men, but they were a group of people who were really thinking hard about how do we take Judaism from the temple into the home? How do we reinvent ourselves so that this rich history of thought and of moral intuition and of instruction, how do we hold that in a way that the generations to come can delve into that and can use that as a guide for living? And one of the things that the rabbis talked about a lot is this idea of what's termed as Svara, which can be understood and maybe should be understood as about moral intuition. And it's about being able to look at the world and look at our history and tradition of teaching, and to say that no longer fits for the world that we're living in. It doesn't fit for the world that we're living in because it marginalizes people, or it doesn't fit for the world that we're living in because it forgets some people, or it doesn't fit for the world that we're living in because actually it oppresses others. And actually our job is about really kind of taking onto ourselves and being brave in order to begin to kind of think about how we can reimagine what those ways of living can look like, and about how those instructions for living, how they need to be reimagined in order that actually they're a foundation that support people in their flourishing and their thriving. So for me, that's what my Judaism is about. It's about how do we build community together so that we flourish? How do we build community together so that each and every one of us thrives? And how do we hold a community together where actually we support one another in our own different expressions about what it means to live a meaningful Jewish life, and recognizing that is going to look and sound sometimes very different and sometimes slightly different to one another, but that what we do is we do that in partnership and we walk that path together. So I suppose my Judaism is a Judaism which is brave and which is willing to be brave, and very much understands that Judaism is about belonging, right? It's really hard to be Jewish by yourself. To be Jewish, one needs to have community. And so it's up to us to build community that has enough spaces for us all to be able to step in and to feel that we belong. And so that very much is the Judaism that I try very hard to live. And it's a Judaism, I think, that for me kind of is also intrinsically concerned with issues around social justice, which I think is intimately connected with inclusion and belonging. And it's concerned with issues of oppression and prejudice and poverty and exploitation, about our planet and about the future that we're bequeathing to our kids. And it's about raising the voices of those that often aren't heard. And so I think it's a Judaism that seeks to understand what the world is trying to teach us, and that is humble enough to be prepared to listen and to think and to slow down. And I think, that also kind of tells us that, ours is not to turn away. There is a beautiful saying, rabbinic saying, which is that, it's not up to us to finish the work, but neither can we desist from starting. And so I think my Judaism, and I can see the journey from Dov to Meir to perhaps to what I'm describing. I personally can see the threads which kind of holds all of these different stories together. But I think my Judaism is about how we create a world where we're not all the same. God forbid that we should all be the same, but that we can build together a world which allows us all to flourish and to thrive.
Thank you very much. And whilst Cath's getting ready for the questions, my feeling is that you come across, all of you, and I thank Kath, Meir and Dov, that you're all a one family with togetherness, with the core being Judaism. And there is an inner joy and peacefulness in all our speakers. And despite the history of the world and the world around us today. So I'm going to ask Kath to now look to manage the questions. Are you there, Kath?
Yes.
Has anybody written any comments, or shall we just do it by hands?
I think we'll have to do it by hands because there aren't any in the chat.
So does anybody like to ask a question of our three speakers? Yes, Judith.
Okay.
There we go.
Yeah. The Judaism that all three of you have described seems very, very different from the Judaism that you see in North London, with the men in their big hats and their black cloaks and their curls and their totally secluded life. How does that fit? It doesn't seem the same religion at all. Does that make sense?
I think Meir's nodding his head.
And I think Dov was going to respond.
Okay, lovely.
Yes, it's interesting, Judith, because these are the Jews who are more visible that you see around you, right? I mean, these are people that you immediately say, okay, this person is a Jew, right? You immediately recognize the man, especially. And when I am out and about, I don't wear my kippah outside. I wear a skull cap, and everybody wearing like a cap or whatever. And it is the same Judaism, I would say, but we are just open to the world, to the rest of the world around us. I don't wear a certain clothes which actually identify me as belonging to a certain community. I wear clothes according to the fashion that dictated to me, right? But we definitely celebrate the same festivals and in more ways than not, in the same ways, actually. But we prefer, as Rabbi Kath said, to be more inclusive, to face out as well. We live in Weybridge, and we want to engage with the rest of the community of Weybridge, right? We welcoming people from all faith into our community to see what we are doing. So we are not inclusive. We try to be as much as possible open to other ideas, but also be progressive in what we are doing, right? There are more ways to do things than one way of doing it. So I would say we in our community, we embrace Orthodox Judaism, but we embrace other ways to express the same ideas.
Can I ask a supplementary question?
Please do.
Do the extremely conservative Jews accept you as Jews?
So I think that would depend. So I think both Dov and Meir would absolutely be accepted as being Jewish. No doubt about it.
And you?
No. Very unlikely. Very unlikely. And that's as much about who's a rabbi as much as it is about who's a Jew. It's about who gets to decide whether status can be conferred upon an individual or not. So it's as much a question about who carries the authority to make those decisions. So that's, and I think that, there's something that perhaps we've touched on, but we've not talked about specifically, which is the role of Jewish law or of halakha. So Dov talked about customs, and that's what I think Dov you were referring to. But about the role of Jewish law and about how one can and cannot live, what one must and must not do, and when it needs to be done, and about what it means to live an observant Jewish lifestyle. So for some, that the definition of what it means to lead an observantly practicing Jew is about adhering to halakha, about adhering to Jewish law. And then I think within the progressive world, so certainly Reform Judaism has a saying, which is that halakha has a vote, but it doesn't have a veto. So there may well be. So for instance, I think at the very beginning, I described the fact that the community that belongs to Northwest Surrey Synagogue is geographically quite dispersed. If people, if we were to say that, if in order to come to synagogue you need to walk, we would have very few people coming to synagogue. Over COVID, if we had, as some communities did, if we felt that, we were unable to use digital media in order to conduct services and give people access to services, then, we would have gone through, and many people would have gone through, I think, an even more challenging and difficult time. And it's not that communities didn't. Communities did, and some communities found ways around that by gathering virtually before Shabbat came in, for instance. So I think, it's always this balance of what, you know, and I talked a little bit about what does it mean to live Jewishly? What does it mean to do Jewish, and who gets to decide, and where are the parameters? And at what point, you know, what point is the red line crossed, and where is it, and who gets to put it there? And I think the one thing that we can say is that Jews of all different stripes and colours, we share the same texts, right? So we have the same canonical texts. So I think, you know, if we were to look at Messianic Judaism, there would be a distinct difference there, because Messianic Judaism shares an additional text which is not understood to be canonical. So we may do our Judaism in a whole variety of different ways, but what we share together is the same holidays, the same texts, and a theology which at its core, I think, is you know, you can see where the connections are, and that there is a theology which is shared. It may be interpreted slightly differently if we're thinking about the Messiah or the Messianic age, but in essence, we have a common theology and we share a common group of canonical texts, even though we do things quite differently in some ways, and in other ways, there's not very much difference at all.
Nabil, you wanted to ask a question. You can't hear you. Can you put your sound on? Nabil, can you put your sound on? Thank you.
Sorry. Yes.
Yes, okay.
Thank you very much for a wonderful series of talks. And I really admire the brave openness and facing the world as it is that I heard. It really is a very refreshing attitude. I just wanted to ask now, in attaining this set of feelings and maybe theological interpretation, the question is, was it interpretation that you've been through the process of, or was it discarding certain things that are not appropriate for the times we're living in? And if it is the latter, then is there a point where you can reach a state where you think, are we Jews anymore? If we start discarding so many things. I understand the communal force and glue that brings the Jews together. That's marvelous. That's always been the case. And this is how they survive all these difficulties. But at what point, or whether there would be a point where discarding certain basic things that have been mentioned in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Numbers and all these, at what point can you think, well, are we Jews anymore?
Thank you, Nabil. Who's going to answer that one?
I'll go after Dov. Dov, you go.
I'm happy to answer it. So Nabil, I don't know if you listened to when I started to talk about my background and family.
I have, and I like the fact that you come from Iraq and I come from Egypt, so we're neighbors.
Well, there you are. So I think Rabbi Kath alluded to it a little bit when, after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, Jews were dispersed all over the globe, if you like, right? They arrived there, and they developed their own costume their own understanding of what Judaism is. And so we start to evolve over time. And Orthodox Judaism do as well. So they're not stagnant in what they're doing. They evolve all the time. And even in antiquity, there were some texts within the Torah that were not read publicly to people. You know, text which is derogatory to women and war and stuff like that was not read to the public because, you know, the great rabbis did not want the public to know about idolatry, for example, and stuff like that. And so we evolve over time, and we are part of this evolution. And for me, as a progressive Jew now, I feel that I should identify for myself who I am, my own identity. So if I call myself a Jew, if Rabbi Kath called herself a Jew, then she is a Jew and I am a Jew as well, if it makes sense what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
So I think building on what Dov has said is that, first of all, that Judaism and the communal expression of Judaism has never been static. And that the rabbi, so I talked a little bit about this idea of Svara, this idea of moral intuition. And so so what makes us Jews, I think, is about how we share our canonical texts. And one of those canonical texts is the Talmud. And that is this huge compendium of rabbinic questions and arguing and deep thought. And this idea of Svara about overturning something which may well be in Torah, but actually is understood to be oppressive and exploitative and not fitting, that was a process. That's not a modern process. That is a process that has been going on now for thousands of years. And I suppose a good example would be about the laws around the rebellious son. So if the son is rebellious and continues to be rebellious, then the father is to kind of bring him down to the gates, to the elders at the gates, along with his mother, and is and that young man is to be executed, right? Because actually he has shamed his father in terms of his ongoing poor behavior. And the rabbis overturn that. They overturn it. They find a way of overturning it, and they basically say, the days have gone where, basically that there is no one now among us who is so untainted in their behaviour as to be able to make that kind of decision. So they find ways of overturning it. They find ways of overturning, the most terrible kind of torturous examination and investigation of a woman who is suspected of being an adulteress. But we have that in Torah, but they find ways of overturning it. So, 2,000 years ago, the rabbis are in the process of saying, this is morally no longer appropriate. This doesn't fit. And I think, and as Judaism itself has continued to grow and to shift and to change, and as we have a greater understanding about what the world is trying to teach us, then that is something which continues to be undertaken. And I don't think it changes what it means to be Jewish or the nature of Judaism. Because actually we are inheritors of a tradition which is really strongly rooted in asking the questions, and is really strongly rooted in knowing that in order to actually build a better world together, that is very much in the hands of human beings. And it's in the hands of human beings in partnership with God, but it doesn't mean that we don't question what's in the text and whether it remains appropriate. We don't discard it, we struggle with it. So the whole, this idea of struggling, of constantly being open to struggling and to asking the questions, and sometimes they're really difficult questions and they're difficult struggles, but actually I think that is the core of what it means to be to be Jewish.
Thank you.
May I add to it something?
Yes, please do.
Okay, Nabil, I was thinking as you were asking it that there's some more extreme Orthodox people who would be jumping with joy with your question. Yeah, and I mean,
I'm not one of them.
Yeah, I know. And I can tell you because I worked for 16 years in an Orthodox Jewish school, and I know the response. Actually, I must say that things have changed for the better. But when I started in 2002, I remember people students coming to me secretly and say, "Sir, are you going to a Reform show?" And I would say, "Yeah." Say, "Me too." It was like we were in the underground, in Israel, one of the things that used to really aggravate me, you would have ultra-Orthodox people in the central bus station. They would stop you and they would say, would you put a tefillin today? Kath, how do you say tefillin?
Tefillin.
Yeah.
Tefillin.
Tefillin.
Phylacteries. So it's the box on the
something that you put on your arm and on your head. If you saw the picture that I did in the morning, and the next question would be, so what kind of a Jew are you? I would say much better than you are. So there are people who think that what they are is the right Jew, and other people don't have the right to think differently. And I think that actually these people are missing one of the main meaning of the word Jew. It is the person who struggles with God. Jacob got the name Israel after a whole night of fighting with the angel. And if you look, you know what, can I quote something from, there's a great Israeli writer, his name is Amos Oz, is well translated into English. I think all of his books are translated into English, very well known. And he wrote something about Israel arguing with God. And he said, Jews don't have a pope. Because if there was a Jewish pope, any Jewish person would come to him, how would you say, pat his shoulder and say, okay, listen, you don't know me, I don't know you, but your grandfather and my uncle once used to do business in Eastern Europe or in Morocco, and therefore let me give you two. If somebody says, I am, my Judaism is the right Judaism because I follow all the rules, maybe you should ask him or herself, are you really a Jew?
Okay.
Jackie, you wanted to ask a question.
It was really more of a reflection, a comment on, and my appreciation of all three of you, of how you've shared your journeys, which have been so different and so interesting. And I think there's a parallel to be drawn there, as we're a multi-faith forum, with all of our faiths, how we've struggled through all sorts of dark times and difficulties, and are still doing that. We're hoping we're growing. And at last we have a Pope, I would say to Meir, who has said he wants to know what we think. He's starting to say we're journeying together, synod, which in Greek means journeying together. And he wants to know what we really feel. Do we think the church is listening to us? Can we speak openly about what we believe in this modern world and what Christianity means to us, Catholicism particularly, but broader than that? And it's a great moment, I think, in time that all of our faiths are searching in this way. It's the same in Islam and in so many other faiths. And it seems to me that this is how we feel closer to each other, because we're all journeying and discovering. And I was reflecting that this morning at morning prayer, the majority of the prayers that I said were Jewish. They were Psalms.
Mm.
And that was such a blessing. And every morning they give me such joy. And I just wanted to say thank you, really, and to say we're journeying together. Isn't it that good? Thank you.
Yeah. Jeff, did you want to ask a question?
I'm just wondering how one trains to be a rabbi. Is there some sort of college or anything that unifies the thinking of the rabbis? I can understand that there are people who obviously teach, and I take it they're chosen by a particular community of people to be the rabbi for them and invited to take this role on. So is there any sort of common preparation for it? Or is it just a case of, people studying and suddenly saying, I'd like to be a rabbi, and then I find a congregation that says, well, we think like this lady, this is our rabbi, and that's how we'll develop. And how much community of thinking is there between rabbis, or will you find one that's at one extreme and another at another extreme?
So, yes, there is an institution of training. It's Leoback College. So it's the seminary that serves all of Europe. There are two others in Europe. There's one that's beginning in France, and there's also one that's in Germany. And then the other institutions of rabbinic training are in the States. So it's a 5-year training program, which culminates in a master's and ordination. And the tradition of bestowing the title of rabbi upon somebody it's about an acceptance from one's colleagues. So it's from other rabbis who themselves have been accepted by other rabbis who actually so we're given smicha, which is kind of the covering. It's like, so with that actually that it's about the passing on of the tradition in a chain going across generations. But it's not something that someone can just rock up and say, actually, I really feel like I'd like to be a rabbi. Do you fancy working with me? So actually there is a whole process of selection and admission into the college. It's a very intensive 5 years worth of academic and vocational training. And then it's the acceptance from the community of rabbinic colleagues who say, yes, we think you are at a level now where we believe that you have sufficient knowledge and skills in order to lead a community. And then in terms of working with communities, that's the job interview. That's about, again, the marriage between a rabbi and a community. And we often talk about it as, as it being a fit, because, we may all work in the same movement. We may, most of us have trained in the same institution, but we will have a whole variety, there is plurality among us in terms of how we live out our Judaism, how we, and as we often talk about how we build our rabbinates, because we will have particular skills that we bring, or particular areas of interest, and particular ideas about what Jewish life, what Jewish life could look like. So, we're not all, I think we share a whole host of common values, but then they will be lived out and interpreted with nuance.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Anybody else like to ask a question? I'm looking around to see fingers up or anything. No. So, Michael, did you want to say something? Can you put your sound on? Michael, can you put your sound on, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you, Michael.
Thank you. I think it was Kathy mentioned Messianic Judaism. I wonder if somebody could say a little bit more about that.
So the reason I brought it in, because I think I was trying to answer my own question, which is where's the boundary? You know, where's the boundary in terms of, and I think talking a little bit also to Nabil's question, which is when do things become so different that actually maybe it's not recognisably Jewish anymore? And I think, you know, for many different people within the wider Jewish community, that boundary can be in different places, and we might not agree on where some of those lines are. But I think the one thing within the normative Jewish community where there would be agreement is about when Judaism really stops becoming Judaism and becomes something else. And I think Messianic Judaism is a very live example of that. And I think that's about a shift in theology. It's a shift in the canonical texts that you know, so across all of our stripes and different colours, the thing that we share together is we share our canonical text. There is no difference in the text that we understand to be authoritative and sacred. And so we may have different theologies around the coming of the Messiah, or whether that's a messianic age. We may have different theologies around who can carry communal authority and decision making, you know, about whether that is extendable to women or not, and about the place of women within communal life. We may have difference in theology around the imperative of halakha, of Jewish law. But what we don't have a difference in is our agreement around the text from which we derive a lot of those understandings. And Messianic Judaism it's introducing a different text. It brings in the New Testament. It brings in the personage of Jesus as being the fulfillment of the Messiah, which is a complete break from normative Jewish theological understanding of what constitutes Jewishness and a Jewish perspective and theological perspective in the world. So I think, you know, at that point, we would say that is not Judaism, that's Christianity, and it's something distinctly different.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think there isn't a religion today that hasn't, partly coming out of COVID as well, that isn't struggling to make today's world fit into the scriptures, or the scriptures fit into today's world. And from what I was hearing from you all speakers, that in fact what you are doing is creating a heritage and a strength of your religion for the future generations, because we have moved on. Life has moved on, but there needs to be the core of believing, and your choice of believing comes from your family on the whole. And people who live without a belief, I just can't understand, but that's their choice. But as I say, there isn't a religion that isn't trying to sort of say, what does our religion, taking the laws of our religion into the present century and for the future. And it's almost, if I dare say, survival in the nicest sense. So can I thank a lot, Kath, Rabbi Kath and Meir and Dov, for your words. It was wonderful to hear about how you came to be here today. And may we wish you the continued joy that you spread in your whole being of being members of your faith, but also of our community. And thank everybody for coming. If I can just do one bit of homework.